Oh, yeah. What is up, Theology nerds? This is Tripp. And on the other end of the line is the one and the only Bo Daddy.
Top of the morning to you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what I'm talking about. It's good to see you, Bo.
It's good to see you. I was on vacation last week, and I thought you and I were going to be able to record, which I was really looking forward to. But it turns out that when you share a cabin with 3 other people, not everybody is up in the morning when it was time to record.
Are you saying that they did not want to overhear us discussing religion and science at 7 a.m.?
I got the sense that wasn't going to work for everyone.
I'm glad they made their desires clear. Oh, man. Well, that just means I've been marinating with that you wanted to talk about this, so it just makes me excited.
Yeah, we've been sitting with this for a while. I'm actually really excited to pick your brain on this because I am nearly ignorant.
Well, look, I wasn't going to name call this early in the morning, Bo, but so how was camping then?
Oh man, it was
Cabbining.
good. So I have a special situation. You know, my wife and her father share a birthday, and so we decided to have a big family party this year. And I got to see nieces and nephews, some of which I haven't seen in a while, and some of which I've never met. And it was a delight, man. You know, I think for all of us, the accordion of time, as they call it, in where days go by so quickly, or I'm sorry, seem to take forever sometimes, especially when we are in lockdown, and then months just disappear instantly. You know, I was introduced to this idea of the accordion of time. It really is amazing how you feel connected to people over the miles because of technology, but you can go years without seeing them or like meeting their kids. And yeah, anyway, it just makes you really value getting to spend time with people in a different way. And then I've had an interesting thing happen since I've been back. I don't know if it's because people are traveling for the end of the summer, but I've had several colleagues who I haven't seen in years happen to be passing through my town. And I don't get that many visitors in southern Idaho because usually it's
not a high traffic area.
It's not a destination area for most people. But I've had 2 in the past week and then 1 more this coming week. I'm very, very excited, but it is odd to catch up with people who you have not talked to in a long time. And yeah, it has me very reflective and very sort of sentimental and sort of philosophical, just thinking about how long you can go without seeing somebody, and then how good it feels to connect with them, but also realizing, like, you know, it could be 5 years if we're not intentional about it until you connect with people again. It really just anyway, I'm very reflective these days.
Ooh. Well, I know I'm looking forward to hugging you at Theology Beer Camp in the flesh. That's exciting. We talk on the internet, but then it'd be in person.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And also, hugs are more rare than they used to be just because, you know, now, you know, you want to make sure everybody's on the same page as far as the physical contact and right. And so you can't just initiate an embrace.
Well, I just want to give you permission.
Ahead of time. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Enthusiastically consenting big man hug.
Yes, and
there's only a few friends that can get their arms all around me and
I was just
move me
about to
around.
say the same thing because of I have so much carnitas, you know, of the incarnitas as I call it. That and with the length, and the girth all together, you put it all together, it's going to be a deep, warm embrace.
Yeah. Look, I think you and Tim Burnett in the same place. We just need a Tripp sandwich. You know what I mean? It's when I hang out with y'all, I just feel more normal. I'm just like though I've this past week I passed I've now lost over 50 pounds in the last 2 years.
Really?
I had to get, like, my kettlebell coach sent me a new belt. I was like, "Look, I've added 5 to
Wow.
my belt because they don't work anymore," and he's like, "So, how long do you have to keep habits and stuff before you think you're not gonna slide back? Have you considered getting a belt that, that fits?" And
That's
the
funny.
one, I was like, I'm gonna get new clothes that really fit right before Theology Beer Camp."
Yeah.
Um
Dude, that's pretty funny. I was talking to somebody last week about how easy it is to pick up bad habits and how
Uh-huh.
difficult it is to persist in good habits.
Yeah. You know my trick, though? I
Yeah,
found that, I just watch things I, like, know,
yeah.
but are entertaining enough to distract me, or, like, mediocre TV shows, or when
Okay.
stuff gets re-added, I'll rewatch it while I'm working out, but when I'm going big, like, if let's say I wanna set a new record for myself, I just turn on the Battle of Helm's Deep
Yeah.
and go for it.
Really?
Yeah,
Huh.
I'm just, like, pounding these giant bells,
Wow.
swinging them around, and then, like, once Theoden and Aragorn are sitting there, and it's like, "Let us ride out," and then he, like, hears the voice of, "Look for me at the dawning of the third day," from Gandalf. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. Let's do this."
Two reflections. One, I really appreciate that you've matured in your approach to this because back in 2015, I clearly remember your exercise plan was to be calorie neutral. You That was like a public stance that you had taken, is that you burnt enough calories on the
Yeah,
treadmill every day or whatever you did so that you could do whatever you were going to do in the evening. I remember this
breaking
policy.
even.
So I'll in a moment of confession, since we are uh, gathering here, I will tell you, I in the last couple years have developed a problem, which is that I only sleep till like 4 a.m. and from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. I'm very disciplined and I would say healthy ish.
Yeah, 12 hours is the appropriate amount of self-control you can
Thank you.
bank on. After
Okay,
that, lead me
right,
not
but
into temptation, Lord.
things start to fall apart at 4. Not 4:20, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, like, after 4, after 12 hours, and then the evenings, I think I undo all of the good I did during the day.
Yeah, yeah. Last night, I gave in to temptation and
Uh-huh.
had shredded chicken breast at 11 o'clock.
Oh, no. Yeah, that's not enough time to burn that off before you.
No, I mean, I was in a calorie deficit for the day, but when you lift weights for an hour and track everything, that's not that hard,
Mhm.
but then I definitely went over what I was going for because I was so freaking hungry,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
and and now that kids
Well,
are
that's
back in
just
school.
science. That's
Yeah,
science, man.
now that kids are back in school,
Oh.
you know, I have way more control over what happens in the day. Like, the likelihood that someone's gonna come in here while we're doing this is way down. Because there's not anyone in pajamas that just woke up saying, "Dad, it's summer. Can you make me breakfast?" And I'm like,
Di
"I made breakfast 2.5 hours ago."
did you start saying pajamas when you were over in England, Scotland?
How do you say it?
Pajamas.
Okay.
Because you put
I
the
would have recognized either.
'Cause I love the jam. You gotta put the jam in pajamas.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
never heard you say pajamas before.
Well,
That was very
oh, I wanna tell you 2 things.
okay.
2 things. 1, I'm getting close to launching this big Bonhoeffer,
Yeah.
project I've been working on, and when we get the first episode done, I wanna send it to you to tell me what you think.
Oh,
'Cause we're
okay.
getting voiceovers of, like, the quotes from Bonhoeffer and other
No way.
German people getting voiceovers, and it's kinda fun because Jeff Pugh and I had we wrote an entire script, essentially a book,
Yeah.
for all 8 episodes, and then all the people we footnoted, like the Bonhoeffer scholars,
Yeah.
we interviewed them, and then now, like, we're doing the content of the book in conversation with each other and then inserting, like, instead of footnoting, right? We're working on an episode right now of Bonhoeffer in New York. Instead of footnoting like, oh, we footnoted Gary Dorian, we footnoted Reggie Williams or whatever, we pull out quotes from our interviews with them, and then their voices go in. And this is either going to be wonderful or the largest time investment for something that everyone would have been like, I would have been fine if you just did interviews with these people. But
wow. I saw you sent out, I think it was an email that you sent out about the Bonhoeffer. There's going to be a class, right?
Yeah.
Associated with it. Yeah. So, it's interesting when you and I restarted this, you told me about the Bonhoeffer project. And at the time, you and Jeff were just working on it. By the way, love him.
It's been like a year of working on this thing.
Okay. But it's been funny because you ever have that thing where like you think AI is listening in on you or Siri or Google or whatever, and like you mention a vacuum and all of a sudden you have advertisements for vacuums, right? Show up. Well, I don't know if that happened with Bonhoeffer, but you and I had the Bonhoeffer thing. We did the Jehovah Java and how it's a gateway drug and all that stuff, right? Which is really fun. But since then, Bonhoeffer has shown up in a bunch of places that I don't know if I wasn't paying attention before. It's possible. Or if my algorithm is just supplementing now because they know that I have some connection to Bonhoeffer, but I'm seeing Bonhoeffer in the oddest places.
Well, maybe it's the Lord just preparing your heart.
Oh no!
So that you break it to me easy when you go, Tripp, I think you should have just done interviews, man. I don't know how many more hours you put on this, but
I love when people say the Lord. It's so much better than God, right? It's softer.
When in chapel at the University of Edinburgh, when rural Scottish people read scripture, I have decided there was one student, I probably shouldn't say their name, but she was from the Highlands. And she had the most beautiful Scottish accent. I just wanted her to read the Psalms all the time. Anytime they asked me to preach, which, they're like, don't go over 20 minutes. And I was like, so you want a meditation? Because, those Presbyterians in Scotland, not used to Baptist sermons from the South. And I would always ask for a specific person to read scripture. And I would always pick a Psalm just so I got to hear her say, and Lord.
In 2014,
oh Lord, I was like, it's so cute. I just like it. I think you believe it way more than I do when you read the Psalms, and it's just your accent. But
it sounds very sincere. Back in 2014, when Pete Rollins was doing one of his publicity tours, and people were really talking about his work, I taught everybody to read the Psalms in their best Pete Rollins imitation accent.
Just use the accent.
Yeah, and it works. It really works. Even for West Coast liberal Christians, it makes it sound so much more consequential.
Yeah. Like if there's going to be an AI bot minister, it should just be rural Scottish female with a kind, loving voice, like when it's like a lift me up kind of thing, but then like angry, high British voice if it's like the Lord's trying to bring that prophetic fire.
Yeah.
Do you remember when Pete lived at my house?
I do.
Okay, so he came up.
Should I say I do?
I do. Yeah, he came up the other day with someone was like, "Oh, do you know Pete Rollins?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then of course my kids are like, "Oh, Uncle Pete." And then they're like getting pictures of him in family photos from the time he lived with us. And I had forgotten and remembered that Elgin, because of Shaun the Sheep cartoon, thought that all Irish people had sheep.
That's right.
And the first time before Pete had moved in, he'd just come to LA probably for a podcast or something was at our house. And I was like, here's my friend Pete. He's from Ireland. And Elgin at this point is like 4 or 5. And he's like, oh, does he have a sheep? Does he have sheep? And Pete's just like, yeah.
He played along.
And he would pull pictures up on Google image search, and showed it to him early on. So then years later, like he had never pieced together that they weren't even pictures of his sheep, because he never looked again. So he just kept it in there. And, then he's like in 4th grade or something. And he's like, yeah, Pete's family has some sheep in Ireland. And Pete's like, anyway. Okay, the other thing I was gonna tell you before we
Yeah.
talk, I wanted to pitch you on the Theology Nerd stage. I wanted you to be the podcast facilitator for.
Oh, yeah.
Because we were talking
We did.
and okay, so here was the theme. It'd be the futures of liberation theology,
Oh,
and Grace G. Sun Kim,
uh-huh.
Corey Walker. Do you know him? He's the new
Only
dean
by
at
name.
Wake Forest Divinity School, but does like critical theory and Black studies and the church. Aaron Stauffer, who wrote his new book on movement organizing in religion,
Okay.
and Jorg Rieger.
Oh, my.
And you had to do whatever you want with them. You got.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I am in.
I assumed you would be. I wouldn't have asked you in front of people, but
And
you know,
you did prompt me about a month ago that you had this on your brain, but I'm glad that it's coming together.
I know I've just been putting lots of work into the
Yeah.
schedule and then like lining up and then it's like, well, there's certain stages when the nerd level is high, right?
Yeah.
Like for real scholars from different perspectives on this, you have to have someone that's comfortable with it and knows how to how to manage it so the audience follows along and enjoys it. And I
All
tend
right.
to put myself on those or someone I trust. And this one, I
Oh,
was like, this has to be good.
oh,
And I know that you really wanted to talk to Grace.
I do.
And so I'm like, all right, so Bo has to do this one.
Thank you so much. That is awesome. And a couple ideas that we ran by that I think I'm gonna end up doing. We're thinking about coming up with a bingo card.
Uh-huh.
And which is gonna be fun because the thing that you have designated about this room is that it's the one place where you don't have to define terms.
Right.
You just get to use your big words without clarification or explanation.
I think in the middle of the page, the free space should be the commons, right? Like it's
Uh,
a nice little a nice little critique of the move to private property and early capitalism. It's just the commons, or it could be the proletariat. Everyone gets the proletariat.
yeah. Good. So we'll start working on that. That sounds like a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to it. By the way, one of my guests who I told you dropped by last week is going to be at beer camp, and I'm so excited.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's gonna be a really, really good time to connect. I'm excited, and
Dude,
I just saw that it's almost sold out.
yeah. Yeah, there's like over 500 people already coming. And so I'm just saying. Oh, and there's a streaming ticket now too.
Do they
Uh,
have do they have to sign doctrinal statements to get in or,
no, there's just there is a community values statement.
I was just gonna ask.
So there's like a how we relate statement. There's not a what
Good,
you think statement.
good.
Because if we had a doctrinal statement, that would like be the worst room to have one. Could you just imagine
No.
that many theologians and then people that like listening to theologians on purpose, probably because they have questions their church won't let them have, and then those people have to come up with a doctrinal statement? I bet we get as far as like God or whatever is harbored in the event that is sometimes symbolically used towards God, tends towards an almost instinctual way towards justice and love. And then they're like, out Jesus. Just and they're like, what about Jesus? No, that's all we got.
That's
We're
all we
just
got.
everyone here is familiar with the name, positively disposed towards it most of the time. Maybe not
Yeah.
that Syrophoenician woman bit, but everyone has their growing edges, even the
Mm,
Christ. So,
yeah.
all right,
All right,
those are
2
the two
things
things I was telling you.
before we talk religion and science. 2 things I wanted to tell you that I think are really funny. One is you mentioned, somebody asked about, like, "Do you know Pete?" And you're like, "Oh, yeah, I know Pete." Well, from time to time, I forget that not everyone knows sort of our background and where we come from, and, somebody will ask me a question like, for instance, this is a true story. Somebody said, "You know Rob Bell?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they said, "What do you think of him?" And I said, I told them the story and blah, blah. And they said, "I meant, do you know about Rob Bell's books? You know Rob Bell?" I was like, "Well, I used to." But That happened with Pete Rollins too. Somebody asked me if I knew Pete Rollins, and I'm like, yeah, I know Pete. And I started telling stories. They're like, I'm in his books. You know him? So it's really funny when you have a show like A Homebrewed where you get to interview authors and thinkers. You do get to, and especially when you live in LA, you get to network and be, in the same room with people. I quote Jorg Rieger probably more than any other human. He is so quotable. So I am excited to talk with him. But anyway, so people will sometimes ask me a question, and I've learned that I have to go, yeah, why do you ask? And
you don't want to seem like that guy.
well, yeah, but because
where they're like, hey, have you ever, do you know who Elizabeth Johnson is? And then, do you know Ray Zaslin? Oh yeah, well, we hung out at my church a couple times, and they're like,
so it's funny because I'm such an enthusiast, and I don't have.
You are. I appreciate that.
Thanks. And I don't have. I'm not doing it. It's not like I throw it around like trying to impress people. I'm genuinely responding. Like, do you know this person? I'm like, yeah, they're great. They do this and whatever. Anyway, because I'm unguarded, I have learned that I have to ask the follow-up clarification question. At what level do you want to get into this?
Yeah. Not like that one time we were shared a hotel room.
Right. Anyway,
one time we took Flat Pete to a Ryan Adams concert because he ditched us to hang out with Oprah.
Yeah, and a pub tour. He came on a pub tour with us.
Yeah, Flat Pete was making progress in his Love Wins t-shirt. Every year, one of those apps that shows you like, oh, here's your memories. When that comes up, I just send pictures of Flat Pete to Pete, and I feel like it's still a little bitter, but kind of bringing up jokes that make a Irish friend a little irritated is a sign of endearment. I think that's how it works.
Second thing I wanted to tell you because of the Rob Bell thing is, I don't know if you remember this, but when we lived in LA, I got tickets to Rob was recording a pilot show for ABC that never aired
with the dude from Lost,
Carlton Cuse.
Yeah, that's it.
And they were doing like this variety show, sort of church in the round thing. I mean, it wasn't church, but it was interesting. And I got tickets for it. And so I went down and then I hung out afterwards and introduced myself to Rob. And he was like, I love homebrewed Christianity. And so I called you later that evening and said, hey, he'd like to meet us. And so the next night you came down and you and I got to talk with Rob. But I don't know if you remember this. He was really, good with answering questions and everything. But do you remember what he wanted to talk about?
No.
Science.
Oh, was this before or after I did he asked me to give feedback and edits on his we talk about God. Is that how that started?
That's what he wanted. He wanted to pick your brain about science. And I always thought that was so interesting. And then you ended up going and doing this postdoctorate thing, and you'll have to tell us about that. But I sort of during that period, I was focused on something else, and I'm not that into science, and so I didn't really follow your whole journey across the pond and all that stuff in close detail. Then you came back and I wanted to talk to you about it. And I said like, hey, I'm interested. And you said, oh goodness, I have talked about this so much. We're going to bore all of our listeners.
We'll see. You can tell me
right.
You could just, you should give yourself permission to be like, that's enough. Just be like, all right, we can go to the next topic now.
Okay, I'll do that.
This is what you're interested in. Otherwise, you'll be like, oh, it's clear Tripp has a very strong minority opinion and wants to make his case to people that are listening that probably don't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah, I'll probably be able to suss that out.
Joshua Patterson. Bo's a Christian. He's just not into science. Well,
I mean, you can't be into everything, right?
You can't. So I will say the field of science religion is definitely a place that's like increasingly interesting compared to
Really?
what it's been stuck in the past. So there you
Oh,
go.
well, that's good to hear. No, it's, just as a way of introduction, um, I don't know if it's a temperament thing. I don't know if it's an upbringing thing. I don't know if it's one of those things about, like, if you who influences you and what they're into and sort of vicariously that trickles down to you. But for whatever reason, through temperament or upbringing or interaction, I'm just not that intrigued by science and religion. Um, and so it leaves me completely like it's just one of those things I sort of shrug my shoulder at and think, well, I'm assuming somebody else has that, you know? And I don't think that much about it. But I do have some questions and I haven't known who to ask. So I emailed you and said, "Hey, can I just ask you some really elementary questions of like in literally in total ignorance?" And you
Uh,
said, "Yeah."
yeah. So I'm ready to be mildly above ignorant.
All right. I have three broad questions. One, what is the pull, the intrigue, the so when you're an outsider to a subject, right? For instance, my PhD work was in practical theology, which people don't know what that is because in evangelical circles, it's practics like homiletics, how to preach and leadership and stuff like that. But in more academic approaches, um, it can look a number of ways. And for me, it was initially critical race theory and the application, what people did with it. So it got into like qualitative methods. So when I would tell people I was in practical theology, no one knew that meant critical race theory and qualitative methods like interviews, case studies, ethnographies. That's not what people heard when I said practical theology. So I assume that in a subject like science and religion, I have no idea what people are actually studying or what they're actually interested in. So just tell me, like, as an insider, what are people actually studying? What's the draw? What's the intrigue? What
Yeah. Okay, so I would say two things. One, um, the the field of science and religion is thoroughly interdisciplinary. So you obviously have scientists from different disciplines, and they vary dramatically, right? From really hard sciences to social sciences, right? So science and religion as a category, like you get people from all sorts of different scientific disciplines, and then the same is true, which a scientific discipline is going to ask um, is going to ask questions that are um, pertaining to like their research area, right? So the kind of question a biologist asks and such it may or may not have a relationship to any religious or theological content, right? So part of the questions of science and religion, maybe like what does this in particular empirical line of thinking or this particular kind of results and data, like does it have something to say to theology, religious
Oh,
practice or not? And that really imagines what do you think you're doing when you're doing theology, like what
okay.
is theology getting at? So you could imagine it varying, right? If you are say a post-liberal or someone later Wittgenstein, theology is primarily a word game, the organizing of a language game that it connects to a form of life, then you may think in science and religion, you're more attached to an independence model where science and religion are independent. And in the sciences, that you could see that that same recognition that science and religion are addressing different questions, operating in distinct domains. Someone like Stephen Jay Gould, who in science is like there are non-overlapping magisteria. Sometimes you'll hear people say the NOMA position. And he argued that science and religion operate in completely separate domains without overlapping authority. So if science talks about it, it's not related to religion. And so you could imagine an independence model like that that handles topics real differently than say a conflict model where the Bible says X, I assume a literal thing right here, and then there's a biological account of evolution, so it's a conflict model. So then if you talk about how that could interact, it's, you know, Bill Nye the Science Guy yelling at Ken Ham, and and exactly what are you hoping to happen in that dialogue? It's a fight, and it's mostly connected to a priori conclusions that you find out. Some they might disagree on data, but like take a young Earth creationist, there's going to be a lot more problems. And if you take a traditional like intelligent design position, there you're going to have different interpretations of data, and so often the moment you move beyond, say, like we're all in conflict or they're independent, then you have to ask, well, what does that interaction look like? And I think the biggest shifts in science and religion there are a variety of ones that kind of go, science and religion should be dialogue partners. They are distinct in some way, but they can engage in a constructive dialogue and inform each other, enrich each other. And doing so can lead to a better account of both realms. So when you think of how this functions in science, is often, let's say we are asking a question, and this is a big research project I worked on in Edinburgh, say around the nature of consciousness. Are the philosophical theories we use to interpret data for a long time usually got grouped into two sides. There's like a reductive, physicalist, materialist position, where the experience of consciousness that we have is an epiphenomena. It doesn't have causal value, these kinds of things, which seems to get problematized by the fact we have first-person experience. A critique to that theory of mine was leveled even by atheist philosophers, where there's jokingly call it a physicalist position, a physicalist, like physicalist, not just physicalist, because you're saying everything, you're accounting for all of consciousness when you give this kind of account. Well, then there are those who are like, obviously there's consciousness going on. The other position for most of modernity was being a dualist, and there are naturalist dualists and supernatural dualists. But we think of, say, William Lane Craig, and he'll argue for the existence of a soul for X, Y, and Z, or Richard Swinburne argue it for this way. Or now, the moment you have a dualist position, you're accounting for like first-person experience, religious experience, actually quite a few things, experiences of value, things like this, now have purchase sense in your big picture of the world. But then you go like, well, where did consciousness come from? Did it just magically appear one day in 13.8 billion years? There was no consciousness, and then boom, all of a sudden it shows up, right? So you got in this period where this dialogue's going on. We have this different data. Now, how do we bring these different kind of increasing brain studies, different brain sciences, these kinds of things? How do you organize them and integrate them differently when you now start to have results that problematize these kind of two warring positions? Then you start to get new theories. So you get the global neural workspace theory, which is looking at sections of the brain using correlations between interpretation, experience, and what's going on. You get integrated information theory, where you're looking at consciousness and the way it comes online when information's integrated in some organic unit. So you start to have different big theories that then make you ask different testable questions, right? So if you are a materialist or if you're a dualist, you're framing this kind of a priori metaphysical picture you may have, get you to ask different research questions. So of late, say in this kind of dialogue, different kind of panpsychist positions have become increasingly attractive in philosophy of mind, which then gets you to ask a different scientific research question: is how could we falsify or not a different big picture? And so the project I worked on both was engaging in different labs, doing different research and stuff, but also like how do philosophers and different religious traditions interpret questions of mind with a thicker picture. And then you have this kind of ongoing dialogue model. And then the fourth way of really doing stuff in this is called integration. And integration is where you recognize that science and religion are capable of being integrated into coherent worldview. This tends to be the position most process type people do, but there are also most of the philosophical theologies that do metaphysics, that think theological language requires metaphysical statements, are going to either do dialogue in some sense or integration in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
So those two, the third and fourth mode, are increasingly prevalent in science and religion as a field, which means both science can end up having its a priori metaphysical picture, which is often inherited and not reflected upon, critiqued philosophically, and then depending on how you see dialogue or integration, your theological account of the world can be transformed by engagement with science. Oftentimes, how one sees religious doctrine or theological doctrine in your tradition sets you up to exist more in a dialogue style format or an integrative format. Those that go for the integration side tend to be ones that think theological language requires kind of a unified metaphysical account.
Okay.
Does that help at all? Or
Yeah, that I could not have anticipated that was gonna be your answer. That's really I mean, that's a really helpful response because I knew as an outsider that I wouldn't be able to tell you what's the inside baseball conversation, you know?
Mhm.
And, alright, so my next question is, how much of it is so I only know 2 kinds of science. One is like test tubes and repeatable experiments, right? And the other is sort of speculative metaphysics, like quantum mechanics and the stuff I see Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about, with black holes and light and whatever. So I'm assuming that in between test tubes and repeatable theories, experiments, and speculative metaphysics of quantum quarks and bending light and right Hubble telescopes. I'm assuming those are the extremes and that's not really what's happening in the large middle.
Well, yeah, okay, so I would say the some popular science authors are bad philosophers and don't know it.
Okay.
So, like a great example is like if you read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion,
Yeah.
his
I tried.
explanation of the proofs for God's existence wouldn't pass like intro to philosophy of religion,
Okay.
and it's not because the proofs necessarily work and you have to believe in God. It's just he doesn't understand how philosophical language works, in how those concepts develop and what they're
Okay.
referring to.
All
So,
right.
like sometimes out of that, you get when a scientist, which are unless they're like a philosopher of science, are really trained to get more and more specific to to find out how you have testable regularities and discover empirical habits, laws about the world, a way of understanding and extracting a kind of a knowledge from existence, which you think of in the test tube. The big picture type stuff is always an interpretation, and what is your orientation when you go to interpret uh, the collection of data? You have theories, and these theories can make certain assumptions. And if you're making one kind of assumption, you may not even think of asking or testing for something. So, oftentimes, the big popular accounts of science, it's like, do you really want to explain to normies that when you're showing the picture of the cosmos, of that it was actually radiation that was then put into very small differences in light in a computer, and then it's colorized so that it looks cool, and that's absolutely not what was picked up, like, so and then when you're communicating information, it's information is always contained in a story. Like there's in a narrative structure, right, of knowing, asking questions and such. So a lot of times the philosopher, sometimes philosophers of religion or different kinds, help clarify questions for scientific research programs, and then help generate research questions that could hopefully falsify or give greater clarity on the big thesis. So most scientists will just do the math or just do the work because they're focusing on something really big. The moment you get to telling a big story about the cosmos, the moment you get to interpreting it, where something like value or meaning and these kinds of things come in, you've kind of moved beyond strict, science and qua science in a sense, and that's why it's often called metaphysics. And the so like those distinctions, I think, are helpful because for the general person who just hears it, I think we have been trained to shift our. I know this has been falsified more since COVID, but the whole idea of trusting the scientist or the scientist as a kind of high priest for reality as it is in itself. Modernity gave us increasing confidence in the scientist, much like, you had increasing confidence in a religious authority. And like any interpretive authority in community, there are both commitments to the reality they're giving an account to, and then the inertia of community, culture, tradition, what gets filtered or not filtered out by the institutions and such. So it's but in the popular space, often the unexamined metaphysical picture of a lot of science popularizers then gets treated as like the obvious answer if you trust the science. And the what's here's an interesting to me, because Phil Clayton was my advisor at Claremont, who's very much into religion and science, but that was not the main reason I wanted to go study with him.
Okay.
So I ended up learning about it because I took all his classes and then go to do this. I actually found over the course of catching up on religion science stuff and things, like, as someone who's postmodern enough not to lose sleep if they aren't sure about the metaphysical correlates of statements, that the reality, the plausibility of an ultimate reality with axiological engagement with the world is dramatically more plausible than I thought. Like, I'm more confident in an ultimate reality that does things, and that's wild, right?
Oh.
Like, I wouldn't have thought that. Like, I was like, oh, okay. Now, I also, the other big thing I've had in going through it is I realized how many both kind of like materialist scientists make their metaphysical assumptions, and how lots of people in the religion science field go to science, and their science can input and have input on maybe how they interpret their doctrines
Yeah.
or whatever. But there's a whole group of them that their a priori commitment to their confessional tradition means that integrative side
Okay.
is really not up for debate. And while I could not imagine thinking that as a reasonable position for me, right? Like, that's just, I enjoy big questions. I would like to have a better account of the cosmos tomorrow than I have today. And I don't have any fear about my faith or whatever if I change my mind because of X, Y, and Z. But there are plenty who their own existential, the nature of the way they hold their faith, they are going to ask science different questions because they aren't going to be changing big metaphysical things. And so there's been a whole development of called science engaged theology, right? And saying theology is different than saying religion. So this is confessional, science engaged confessional reflection of sorts. And a group of group of friends of mine that primarily came initially out of St. Andrews have developed what they call science engaged theology. And there they have a question that is a thoroughly theological question. But what are the elements of the question then? Like, take the assumptions, take the content of it. Which of them make empirical assumptions or have elements that are testable? Are there ways science in the conversation can actually generate constructive confessional theology? And that is I find that really fascinating. But when you read it and things, you'll notice their kind of a priori confessional commitments are not what science is transforming. It's like the interpretation of, the application of, and so you have, like, in the same way a materialist scientist might interpret all the things like atheism is obvious. they can have an a priori commitment. And so I didn't want to like sound like I'm just crapping on anyone. And they both those groups could just look at me and be like,
Yeah.
you just change your mind on everything so that everything's either being dismissed by your position or integrated so that you can feel good at night, Tripp. I understand why you would critique the kind of integrative position more after hanging out with people that's not their tendency. I don't know how. I personally can't do it.
I'm enjoying this. I especially like words that you're using about the correlate and integrate and correspond. I sort of anticipated that, but I'm enjoying hearing like the actual nuance of how they fit together. A third question that I had related to like when I hear about science or you know, it comes across my desk in some way, usually it's related to something that I would classify as ethics. So, like the 5 examples that I thought of while you were talking there is like the cyber human, like when are we getting to human 2.0, and like if we integrate, you know, bionics into our physical bodily existence, like at what point are we human 2.0, you know, that kind of stuff. If we have chips in our brain or whatever it is, you know. Yep. The other one is weather. It comes up a lot with weather, you know, that the science says if we get 0.2 degrees more, then Florida is going to be underwater, you know, that kind of thing. A lot to do with pregnancy. So whether it's IVF or conception and life and all that stuff, issues of war, like when we use phrases, the U.S. military will talk about collateral damage, but they mean not human non-combatants, you know, sort of thing. We're watching that on both in the Ukraine and in Palestine right now. And then the last one is cancer. Comes up a lot, like trying to cure cancer or, you know, different things. So those are the 5 things that I hear science about is human 2.0, like the biogenetic stuff, weather, pregnancy, war, and cancer. So I know I told you those are like the 5 things. If people were to say like what's science working on right now, those are the 5 things that I seem to hear.
Yeah.
What am I missing?
Oh, well, are you wanting to talk about those 5 things?
No, not necessarily. I mean, they come across my desk. You can if you want.
Well, okay, here are the questions related to this that would show up in science and religion stuff.
Okay.
Like, here's how they would ask the questions about this. So, take like the cancer thing. Like in science and religion context, like the moment you're hanging out with scientists, cancer is not one thing, it's a bunch of different things, right? So a lot of the popularity in the public square is like organizing for the cancer moonshot, right? Like it's a research initiative.
Yeah.
The whole framing of here's a problem, a threat to human existence, and that is something that if we understand it empirically, we can control it, right? Like that logic of let's conquer cancer, defeat cancer and stuff is the like kind of the modern epistemology turned towards something we want to control and conquer. And so like that in the public square is more an example of just like
Okay.
a modern epistemology showing up. So then when it goes to kind of research things around cancer, there's lots of science and religion research on what are the kind of care practices that work best. Like, so actually like having chaplain or being in a religious community, you know, is praying for you. There are all these things where your recovery process works better. So let's say cancer treatment, there's a list of research projects on what works, what kind of care, what kind of communication between doctor and care staff. So you can have like what helps for flourishing in the process. There's a whole interesting research on so like playing games while you're in treatment of like killing cancer cells and stuff, that why does that help treatments at least appear statistically more successful? and things like that, which raises a question of mind and body in sorts of different ways. Right. Like obviously, uh, uh, like no one's against figuring out how not, to save people with cancer. But there are questions about what are ethical and non-ethical ways of testing and trying stuff. Do you want to find out when your mom's dead that she was in a control group and was getting a saline shot? So just you can imagine all these different elements that show up in it, and depending on in medicine, because so many hospitals are grounded in some confessional tradition. The Catholic Church has tons of hospitals, so there are Jewish and Muslim hospitals, lots of hospitals attached to universities that come out of Protestant denominations. The ethics board on research and stuff like that, medical ethics becomes a wild frontier, where the service place has some shared commitments, and then you have what does the ethical freedom of the doctor look like, and what's the look of the patient. The like pregnancy type thing, there like so much of the kinds of questions that get asked around it are going to be based on your a priori moral commitments, right? Like, so how would you scientifically settle, when is a fetus a person, right? So much of it's going to be decided on what you think personhood is, which that's a hard thing to explain and understand. Is if your theory of ethics is connected to pain, then you're at what point does an entity interpret its surroundings in positive and negative ways and move for and against them? What time do they have? Is it sensational pain? Like you could have all those questions, but they already begin with some kind of framework where you're either think back to the different theories of consciousness. Well, is it just matter and motion the whole time? So there's not a question. Is there a point in the process where now there's like the dignity of soul or personhood? Either at the beginning, say like the third trimester. For most of church history, the quickening, where you can feel the baby moving, is the point where you would have the I believe Aquinas' language is the animal soul's destroyed by receiving a mortal one. So all those kinds of things are there. One of the projects, someone I got to interact with some in Edinburgh, Jonathan Delafield Butts, was working on cognitive development in utero, right? So let's say you have a panpsychist theory of mind, and you're like, well, if consciousness, like a materialist, is just a product of the brain, then you should not have in utero the demonstration of consciousness till the child has developed a brainstem, which, if that's where it comes from, you need it first. And so he ended up working on research, and because you actually have biosemiotics, like interpreting the world around you and interacting with it, before there's a brainstem, you're like, oh, well, is this is consciousness before, right, the material substrate of a brain, right? So if let's imagine you're using that, then there's a very different line where you might say, oh, it's personhood or it's conscious. So the things get so complicated in that space that even people researching things like that, you're not going to get him to say a word about how it would impact like an ethical framework, because it's the political and kind of ethical energy of it in culture as a culture war item. Well, just the scientists are like, well, I don't want to mess with this. The last thing I want is to, get tied up in it. There's tons of research that, like, at this point, most people think you arguing about the existence of climate change is kind of a waste, but there's tons of research of how individuals actually get to cooperative collective action to make changes. And so cognitive science of religion, psychological sciences and stuff have been leveraged to, like, how do religious and wisdom traditions respond to the climate catastrophe? What's the process of changing minds, and can we test what kind of data framing and story helps a larger number of people put climate priorities higher? As we came to understand in psychological science, moral foundations of reasoning, that there are different kinds of moral reasonings that different personalities have. Often more progressive types will keep using progressive language towards conservatives, and if you just switch the modality of explaining it, it now connects with what they experience as a virtuous language, right? So like sometimes the science, it gets used actually to the communication. The last European Society for the Study of Science and Theology I went to, that was one of the main things. Not is there climate change, but what does how can science help religious traditions, often the leaders of denominations, communicate the nature of climate change in ways that it connects to the religious practitioners' deepest values, and mobilize them for cooperative change? Or how do they think about the role and function of a post-collapse world, the role and function of religious communities? What kind of skills and things should we already be developing within communities for sustaining life with mass immigration or lack of water or food problems, and that kind of stuff. So you see how like these different kinds of questions, there's a lot of different ways different disciplines in science, in the broad science and religion category, can show up and
Okay.
bring to it. The human one, the transhumanism cyborg stuff, is really fascinating. That's a long conversation. But I will say one of the things that happens oftentimes, people in religious communities only think cyborg when there's some technology that was invented after they became an adult that they add on to themselves, right? So when we outsourced our stomach to fire, and then became a species where 6 times more energy is going to our brain, so we've developed the ability for all this other kind of stuff in the story of human evolution. No one goes, "Oh, I'm a cyborg because I cook with fire and don't require my body to do it." Glasses.
Right.
Anyway, you can, they're like, "Oh, do you have a pacemaker? Are you halfway to?" So there's like the relationship of humans and technology is one. When you look at the whole story of our species, we create technology recreates us, and so it's an ongoing story. There are kind of like breakthroughs, right? So when technology enables agriculture, you have a transformation of human society. Writing, there, language as a technology as it emerges. There are all these kind of technologies that reshape us. We make tools reshape us, we reshape our ecosystem. And so the question of human 2.0, cyborg questions, transhumanisms, I think one of the gifts of the larger field of science and religion is we're going to ask, what is humans' relationship to technology? How do different scientific disciplines help us understand what a human is? And then what do different wisdom traditions, how do we engage that, think through it? What's the dignity of a human, right? And so, and I find all that stuff fascinating. There's a host of different things that are relatively unique scientifically about humans. How does that help us think about what, say, within a monotheistic tradition, being made in the image of God would mean, as we understand what humans do and what's going on in us. Yeah.
That is really interesting, and I'm glad you brought up farming, by the way. So I added agriculture to my list of things that science comes up in, because obviously the GMOs, the genetically modified organisms, is a big science religion debate or something. I would assume that, but anyway, I added that to my list of 6 things. I had 5.
And even that, so like we genetically modify things all the time. We just do it at a faster pace if when science is used. That's what the whole process of evolution is, modification, right? By breeding and what survives.
I agree, but all right, so here's where I sort of get lost in it, is there seems to be, when you get not the difference of degree, but the difference of kind thing happening. So for instance, I know that we select corn or rabbits or, bananas famously, even deer, so many things, right, are technically genetically modified because of selection for certain traits in breeding and blah blah blah, right? And response to our environment. I don't I don't think anybody's debating that, or at least not in my world. The thing that concerns people is when we do like when we splice in snake DNA to corn so we can grow it in Africa, right? In
Obviously.
drier climates, or frog. If we grow an ear on the back of a frog for then to put it, on a burn victim. Like when I hear about stories like this, that's where people seem to be concerned, is when you are splicing in DNA of something else, right? Like that's where people get nervous.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and the kind of line editing of genetics creates all sorts of ethical questions. I mean, I think the ones that uh, are like the easiest to see how intense it can get are when it goes with humans, right? So,
Okay.
there's one like what do you can know about a person's genetics in utero. They have X, Y, and Z uh, issues in their genes, and now parents are so, do you want to abort or not, right?
Oh, yeah,
Like,
right.
so
Yeah.
there's that.
Yeah.
As the technology gets more and more effective,
Yeah.
um one way of modification is is selection. um Once you like IVF, right? So
Mhm.
you take eggs, get a bunch of sperm, and then you're selecting for the highest quality one, right? So you've already inserted yourself in the selection process by
Oh,
prioritizing
boy.
one fertilized egg
Right.
over another. In our lifetimes, unless we do something really stupid, personally, not, I think as a species, we're probably pretty solid that this happened. We'll have more and more ability to edit genes, um,
Wow.
in the so that you go, oh, I don't know, but then you go, okay, well, we have a baby and there's an obvious heart defect, and we can go in rather early on and switch this, or
Wow.
we the moment you can start editing humans, then you have both the fixing a problem, and then you have enhancement, and this is what humans do with technology. And so is the enhancement element something that we want, right? To what if we eliminated um, uh, the we transformed our blood system so cholesterol doesn't clog,
Mm.
and or something,
Ooh.
that's like obviously good, where you're like, this would be good, we don't have
Mhm.
hearts exploding as often, or you transform so we it's people can digest foods they couldn't have before without swelling, or people that get like even say one of the there's research on using stem cells and
Yeah.
inserting modifications to treat Lyme's disease.
Yeah.
Like there's all these reasons that justify it to be good. Then there are ways you use it because my child would be better off if I, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, as long as all that technology gets sent to the 1% first and then slowly dissipated out and stuff, that creates whole ethical questions, right? The billionaire's kid is the one that walked in with a 200 IQ, high metabolism, perfect cheekbones. So on top of having a tutor and great preschools,
Yeah.
also just added genetic advantage because mom and daddy paid for it, right? So the the there's these whole ethical questions,
Mhm.
and then the inequities of existence, when it's something purchasable, happen. That happens in reverse in the example of food. So there's, oh, we created this, so now places that are drought ridden, probably drought ridden because of uh uh the West extractive economy related to carbon, but nonetheless now we have more resilient seed or
Mhm.
X, Y, and Z. It's going to avoid famine. We're against that. Now what if the company that does it is like, we also want to make sure we get our money back. We're
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
we're not running a charity here.
Right.
So you can't reseed without buying them the seed from us again. So the thing that works here, you're going to have to make sure you buy the seeds from us again, because they aren't going to naturally, like, you aren't going to be able to collect them and redo it. So what ends up happening oftentimes through the genetic modification stuff isn't just, oh, does it help make it more survivable in places where you can feed everyone? It also, oh, will it help it make it more efficient? Will we get higher yield? All the kind of incentives that the market has. And then, oh, now we can modify it where we actually don't, we aren't just like making a better product. We're now controlling it. So you basically have to subscribe to our seed service to grow where you are. That's what humans did with land, right? Once property kind of comes up, when we find something we can exploit for market incentives, we want to own it, whether it's indigenous people, transatlantic slave trade, the shift into cities and the owning of the means of production by a few. Like, we do that. So sometimes these new technological and ethical questions are like new, or like returns to long-term ethical problems that we have.
All right.
Yeah.
One last very practical question. So I was hoping that we would stumble on something to do with updating. So because I grew up evangelical, we learned how to argue against evolution, but we learned a very old model of evolution. There's a newer model, right, that is more about cooperation and collaboration and mutuality and all that stuff, human society, 10,000 year, blah, blah, blah. I was hoping we would stumble on that at some point, but one of our commenters on the side, her name is Billy Ann Farley. She has a question, and I think you might want to talk about it. Says, you have an example of a common language to address carbon dating of rocks in the age of the Earth because, and then our second comment is, this is a frequently discussed topic in the Natural Science Museum in Caldwell, Idaho. So that seems like a very specific question.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think of what common language. So carbon dating is based on the ability to track at the molecular level the movement, dissipation of carbon when something, because carbon has a constant deterioration rate on our planet. So then you can kind of look at it and go, oh, well, here's the age range, right? That works, but not if you're testing live things. So I didn't grow up in this space, but I had as students where some fundamentalist people, like, I want to get a graduate degree from the University of Edinburgh in science and religion.
Yeah.
So then they start telling me this stuff, and I where they were like, oh, well, if you carbon dated a live mollusk, it says it's really old. And I was like,
I'm sure it's made up of.
I was just like, it's not dead. Like, you're not looking at anything that's fossilized. So like the clock for carbon dating requires it to be dead. Right. So like, that's how the deterioration works. And so I was just sitting there, and but you see underneath, right? Like that confusion is, I have a certain final, absolutely authoritative account of creation. And so you must be giving another certain final, absolute account of creation based on another authority science. Just like the Bible, I pull out random Bible verses, and obviously I know what the literal meaning is, and you should handle this. I'm going to pull a Bible verse out of yours. I carbon dated a mollusk. And then you're like, this is not how this works. Like, you're missing it. It would kind of be like getting confused when you're reading a psalm, and it's like, God is the rock of our salvation, the refuge in the most turbulent storm. And you're like, finally, someone has understood the granite person of the quatrinity. Like, well, we got four persons. There's Father, Son, Spirit, and rock. It's right there in the Bible. And you're like, no, it's a freaking poem, man. It's a poem. And so, like, there's this whole like confusion often, at least in my experience talking to really conservative students in science religion class, where they think science should function with the idealized authority they have of the Bible. That is kind of like, and I would say this is just generally true. There are reductive materialists that are God-splainers about the divine, in the same way there are fundamentalists that are God-splainers about science, and so there's that kind of a bit, the assumption you can read directly off nature or scripture for a final, certain authoritative account is a form of misplaced concreteness, whether it's theological or scientific.
Okay. Huh.
So, for example, something like gravity, Bo.
Okay.
Aristotle, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Newton, and Einstein. They all have accounts of gravity that match our experience of gravity at our scale on our planet, right? So if you ask them to explain gravity, they have an explanation. Their math works out. It's internally consistent for making predictions at our scale on our planet. Now, they aren't the same. They disagree. If you asked, are all the theses and all four theories of gravity true? We would assess them true, false in different ways. Okay. But do the theories themselves give an internally consistent account of the phenomena of gravity in our bodies on our planet at our scale? Yes. And so Newton problematizes certain assumptions he's inheriting because he has access to more data. Einstein makes a theory, problematizes Newton at different scales, right? The quantum level functions differently than others. And it takes you have to have telescopes in the right place to check the wave going around a planet at the right time in the middle of a war. And then boom, like here's a whole nother theory. And so one of the things I find helpful about that is we all experience the reality. Phenomenologically, we know what gravity is, right? We make predictions on ourselves and the world and the rest of it around it. And there's four internally consistent, there's actually more than that. There's multiple internally consistent accounts of it. But as we get more data from more scales, from other contexts, when we understand more about our relationship in space and all these kinds of things, theories get more complicated and such like that. But the phenomenological reality is true in the sense of we live in a world, and it's helpful for us to interpret the world with gravity. In a lot of ways, I think concept like something like God functions in a similar way. You can have contradictory but multiple internally consistent contradictory accounts, and then in what way do these different accounts that are explanations of religious and spiritual experience and religious traditions over time, how do we validate whether or not they cohere with a larger unified metaphysical theory? And part of those in the more integrative side of science and religion, kind of like much like Newton had access to stuff that reworked concept of gravity, and then Einstein did it again, and there's a number of contested new models. They aren't like contesting the reality of gravity. They're going like, what if we keep learning things where it requires a bigger or more complex vision to include all we understand about it as our experience of the world, the scale, along with the like our own knowing, right? Like part of what Einstein did is recognize the nature of the knower shaping the knowledge. Like, what if there's multiple accounts? So then, what do you do with it? How do you internalize a growing body of knowledge to explain a phenomenological reality? I don't even know if that's helpful. It's personally helpful to me, where it's like, because like Einstein, like I had a dream once, like Einstein and Pythagoras and Newton are all hanging out up in heaven, and like like they're all just talking about gravity, but no one got pissed at each other, right? When the theory got updated, right? Like Einstein shows up, Newton's been up there lecturing Pythagoras about X, Y, and Z going on, and then Einstein shows up, and he's like, Newton, like, yeah, Pythagoras, this is amazing. Like, you're our scientific heroes, blah, 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 blah. And Einstein's like talking for a bit, and he makes a comment about what he was thinking. And Newton's like, whoa, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, you won't believe this. So we have these things, telescopes. We got really good ones. We put them at two different parts, right where there's a red phase, planets passing between stars. And we notice like the gravity of the planet bends the light because the way how the light wave works. And he's like, what do you mean how the light wave works? Oh, this is fascinating. Let me tell you about this. And like, how did you get pictures of this? He starts explaining it. Newton's like, that's freaking awesome. Like, he's like, this is amazing. You got this. I could see this is exciting. So they're all sitting there. Then another scientist comes up and says, we learned this and this. And they don't go like, oh, that's not what you got. That's not how this works. They don't get pissed when they update their data. They're like, oh, I'm a part of a community that seeks the truth, and we do it well when we get outdone. And more parts of reality can be investigated empirically and internalized, And I think religion would do really well if we thought it's similar, right? But in my head, I just think at the eschatological banquet, Paul might be getting lectured by each of the reformers about what he really meant, and Paul's going to be like, "Sola, what?" Yeah.
Two things as we get ready to wrap up. Your dreams are always hilarious. I remember one time you had been reading a book, and in your dream, you were interacting with the author. And then later, you were getting on an airplane, and the author was sitting on the airplane, and you told him that he was in your dream.
Oh no, it was Cornell West.
I know. That's amazing. That is such a funny story. Second thing, I know we don't have time today, and I'm going to send you a proposal for something fun to talk about next time. I've written all my sermon outlines for the rest of the year, and I want to run some by you if you're up for it.
Oh, okay.
I'm doing a thing called the Word of the Lord, about 9 ways God speaks to us.
The Lord?
What?
The Lord. I was doing the call back to the beginning.
That was a good callback. 9 ways God speaks to us, and I want to take a theopoetic approach. I just think it might be fun to talk about, so I'll send you a proposal. But not next episode, but down the road. You know, something I would love to talk to you about is the conservative impulse from some movements that have gained real traction in the last 20 years, whether it's radical orthodoxy or the trad cath, people converting to Catholicism as adults. But that's not the part I want to talk about. The part I want to talk about is the anti or pre or counter enlightenment and scientific worldview. I would love to explore that with you about how do you see that, and how does that look for you, both having studied what you've studied now, but also having been over on the others in a different culture, and the anti-counter pre impulse of going back to a previous understanding or conception that's pre-scientific.
Yeah. I'm sure it can happen, Bo. You can lure me there.
Somebody's going to start an angry garage punk band called Conservative Impulse. Oh boy.
Oh man, we could have a whole episode just suggesting titles for the garage punk band called Conservative Impulse.
When we were doing what? Oh, Tripp, I lost you. Oh, you're back. Oh my gosh.
So our power just went off and on.
Do you know that for one brief second, I thought that I had to wrap up this episode, and I had no idea how I was going to do it?
Well, it even turned off my camera. So like
we should wrap this up before there's another power outage.
Oh my. Yeah. All right. Well, I think the Conservative Impulse is also kind of they got a little podcast terrorist group, and they're just trying to ruin the stream here, Bill.
When we did Wild Goose West, you brought a band with you. Austin Roberts was in it, and who was the drummer? Who was that amazing drummer?
Andrew and Will Startery was the drummer.
And I kept trying to give them. I just kept trying to give them the band name, Ironic Indifference, and they weren't having it.
Yeah. Lori, my camera's not dirty. It's just the wrong camera. My camera
does look like you put Crisco. It does look like you have Crisco on your lens.
Well, my lights and camera, when the power went off and on, it just never came back on. We'll go see what happened here.
That was amazing. All right, somebody thought it was the Rapture, and I think, dude, if we are live broadcasting and the Rapture happens, and you go and I get left behind, I'm not going to be happy.
Oh, okay. Well, Bo, I would put in a good word for you. You know what I mean? I'd be like, come on. I need the Bo Daddy. What kind of banquet is this with no daddy? And
By the way, the
why would I get
question came up,
raptured?
does science have, an answer to if there's beer in heaven? And one of our Evan said, "No, that's why we have to drink it all here." It's a great
Why
answer. Great
well,
answer.
I'm optimistic. I
Oh,
feel like
really?
in heaven it's calorie free.
I drink by the way, back when I homebrewed, I made an alcohol-free stout one time. I just messed it up, but it was delicious, and I thought, "Well, I don't want it to go to waste." But you could just drink as much as you want because there was no consequence, except I gained like 8 pounds in a week.
Oh god. Yeah. Because that means if there's no alcohol in it, the sugar didn't ferment, so it's probably like a sweet, thick black drink.
It was great. It had undertones of, motor oil, wet dirt, and pipe tobacco.
Oh, all your favorite things.
I know.
Yeah. I remember when I made you the daddy beer.
Yeah, for my 40th birthday.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that one had cherry pipe tobacco, and you had to go down to the store and figure out from the experts how you were gonna infuse that flavor.
Yeah. Yeah, uh, it was a bit on the complicated side.
I loved that story, man. Thanks for doing that.
Alrighty.
Alright.
Well, we will see y'all again later when my